There is a test you can run on any American harbor fort, anyone. Pick one from the list the National Park Service maintains on its website. Drive there, buy the ticket, take the tour, listen to the guide explain when it was built and who built it and why it was built, where it was built. And then when the tour is over, go back outside and look at the walls. Really look at them. Look at the quality of the stone. Look at how tightly the joints are fitted. Look at the precision of the corners. And then ask yourself one question. Does this look like something a young broke republic with a thin treasury and a limited labor force built in a hurry before a war with Britain? Because I have run this test at 11 American harbor forts, and the answer at every single one of them is no. It does not look like that. It looks like something else, something older, something built by people who had more time and more skill and more resources than the official record credits to the named engineers who supposedly designed these structures. And the moment you see that, the moment you actually stand in front of one of these walls and understand that what you are looking at does not match the story you were told about it, the official history of American military architecture begins to fall apart in a very specific and very documentable way. Because the problem is not one fort. The problem is all of them. Every major American harbor fortification on the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast carries the same anomaly. Masonry, too, refined for the period. Geometry that does not match the engineer's other work. Construction records that are thin or missing, or that describe something different from what was actually built. And official explanations that hold together only as long as nobody compares the physical evidence to the documented history. This is the story of what is actually standing at the entrance to every major American harbor, who actually built it, and why the official record has spent 2 centuries making sure you never thought to ask. Let us start with the most visited and the most obvious, Fort Wood, the 11-pointed star fortification at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The official record says it was built between 1808 and 1811 by a young Army engineer named Joseph Gilbert Totten. Totten is a real and thoroughly documented figure. He spent his entire career designing coastal fortifications. His designs are in the National Archives, and in the entire documented body of his work, there is not a single structure that looks anything like Fort Wood. Fort Adams, Pentagon, Fort Monroe, irregular hexagon, Fort Macon, 5-pointed star, Fort Pulaski, Pentagon, Fort Sumter, Pentagon. The same conventional geometry over and over for 40 years of professional work. And then Fort Wood, 11 points, a geometry he never used before and never used again, with masonry that is significantly more refined than any other Totten project of the same period, with no documented explanation in any of his correspondence for why this one fort in this one harbor required a geometry so unusual that nothing like it exists anywhere else in American military history. The standard explanation is that Totten had an unusual moment of creativity at Bedloes Island and then returned to conventional designs for the rest of his career. This explanation requires you to believe that a competent military engineer who understood defensive geometry spent his best creative moment on a design with no military logic and never tried to replicate it or explain it. That explanation does not hold. What holds is the simpler one. Totten did not design Fort Wood. He found it, and he wrote it up as his own. Now drive south. Drive to St Augustine, Florida, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the United States. The National Park Service will tell you that Castillo San Marcos was built by the Spanish beginning in 1672. It is the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States by official account. It has survived 3 sieges by cannon fire and was never taken by assault. The Spanish colonial archives in Seville contain the construction records for the Castillo. When you read those records carefully, not the summary version in the textbook, the actual records in the archive, something unexpected emerges. The engineers who built the Castillo describe the early phases of the construction in language that is consistent not with building a new fortification from scratch, but with incorporating pre-existing earthworks and stone foundations into a new structure. The language they use in their own reports suggests they found something already there and built on top of it and around it. The masonry of the lower courses of the Castillo, when examined directly, is fitted with techniques that the Spanish colonial archives themselves describe as exceeding the capability of their own military engineers in the region. Their own archives say the masonry was better than they could produce, and the walls absorbed cannon fire from 3 sieges without structural failure in ways that the Spanish attributed to the unusual properties of the local stone. Modern structural engineers who have examined the Castillo have noted that the performance of the walls against cannon fire exceeds what the documented construction method should produce. The stone is doing something the Spanish do not fully account for in their own records, because the Spanish did not build the parts that are performing. Now go further south. 60 miles off the coast of Key West in the Gulf of Mexico sits Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. No roads go there. You take a ferry or a seaplane. It is one of the most remote and one of the most impressive military structures in the United States. The official record describes it as an American military construction begun in 1846. The fort is a 6-sided polygonal masonry structure. It contains more than 16 million bricks. Construction continued for nearly 30 years and was officially never completed. The American military abandoned it unfinished in 1874. Now look at what the official construction timeline requires you to believe. Between 1846 and 1874, the United States Army built a 16 million brick hexagonal fortification 60 miles from the nearest land on a sandbar in the Gulf of Mexico. With no permanent settlement nearby to supply labor, no local source of brick or stone, no railway to the site, no harbor capable of handling heavy construction supply ships before the fort itself was built to provide one. The logistical requirements for constructing Fort Jefferson from scratch in the documented period are extraordinary. The manpower requirements are extraordinary. The supply chain requirements are extraordinary. And the official record accounts for all of it with a construction workforce that modern logistics analysis says could not have produced what is actually standing on that island in the time available. What the official record describes and what the physical structure requires are not the same thing. The math does not work for construction from scratch. The math works considerably better for a workforce that found something substantially complete and spent 30 years extending and modifying it, and then called it unfinished when they stopped. Now go north. Go to Boston Harbor. The harbor fortifications of Boston are among the oldest in the country. Castle Island, now connected to the mainland by a causeway, but historically an island in Boston Harbor, has been the site of fortification since the earliest colonial period. The current structure, Fort Independence, was built by the federal government in the early 19th century. The official record describes it as a pentagonal masonry fort built between 1801 and 1851. The foundation of Fort Independence, when examined directly, shows evidence of multiple periods of construction. The lower courses of masonry in several sections of the fort differ substantially in style and quality from the upper courses. The lower courses show the kind of precision fitting that appears in Fort Wood and in Castillo San Marcos. The upper courses show the rougher quality characteristic of American federal period construction. The official explanation for this difference is that the fort was built in stages over 50 years, with different construction crews and slightly different materials. This explanation is plausible. It is also the explanation you would give if you found an existing foundation and built your fort on top of it, and did not want to explain where the foundation came from. The lower courses are older than the upper courses. The construction quality of the lower courses exceeds what the documented American construction workforce of the early 19th century reliably produced. And the location of Castle Island at the entrance to one of the most strategically important harbors on the eastern seaboard is exactly the kind of location that the pattern we are identifying would predict as a site of pre-existing fortification. Now go further north, go to Maine, to the islands and headlands that guard the approaches to the major ports of the northeastern coast. The pattern does not stop at Boston. It continues northward through every significant harbor position on the coast, and it continues southward through every significant harbor position on the Gulf Coast. New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola, every major harbor, every significant strategic position, every place where control of the water approaches would have been important to any civilization that understood naval power and harbor defense. All of them showing the same features when you look at the physical evidence rather than the official record. Masonry that is too good for the credited period. Geometry that does not match the credited engineer's other work. Construction records that are thin or missing or that describe something different from what was actually built. And in every case, the same official explanation. A named engineer, a documented construction period, a plausible but ultimately unsupported account of how the structure was built from scratch with the limited resources of the documented period. The named engineers are real people. The construction periods are documented dates. The accounts are internally consistent, but the physical structures do not match the accounts when you compare them directly, and across dozens of sites that comparison produces the same conclusion. The structures are older than the official dates. The masonry is better than the official credit. The geometry is more sophisticated than the official engineers produced in their other documented work. And the locations are exactly the locations that any civilization with serious knowledge of harbor defense would have chosen. Here is the question that the pattern forces you to ask. If the harbor forts of the American East Coast and Gulf Coast were not built by the engineers and in the periods the official record claims, then who built them and when? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The physical evidence tells us what they are and approximately how old the oldest construction at each site is. It does not tell us who built it or what they called themselves or what civilization they belonged to. What the physical evidence does tell us is that the answer to who built them is not the answer the official record gives, and it tells us that the answer to when they were built is considerably earlier than the official dates. The older travel literature of the 17th and 18th centuries suggests the answer. European travelers arriving in the Americas in the early colonial period describe fortification structures at harbor positions along the eastern coast that they did not build and that the local indigenous populations had not built. Structures that were already there when the Spanish and the English and the Dutch arrived. Structures that the colonial powers incorporated into their own defensive systems and then wrote up in their own official records as their own construction. The same pattern that produced Fort Wood produced Castillo San Marcos and Fort Jefferson and the Boston Harbor fortifications and every other anomalous structure on the American coastline. Someone built them. Someone chose these specific locations with sophisticated understanding of harbor defense and navigation. Someone constructed masonry that has lasted centuries under conditions that should have degraded it faster, and someone left before the documented colonial period with no written record that the official history has been able to find or has been willing to look for. The structures are the record. They are standing in every major harbor on the American coast. measured and accessible and available for examination by anyone willing to look at them the way the official record has trained everyone not to look. Start with Fort Wood, count the 11 points, then drive to St. Augustine, then take the ferry to Fort Jefferson, then go to Boston Harbor, run the same test at each one, ask the same question. Does this look like something the official record says built it? And let the walls answer.